Guten Abend.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the Körber Forum. I would also like to welcome the people who are connected online, and I would like to welcome you to our event, China, a climate pioneer or climate sinner, ? Well, we did not choose the date for today's event by chance. As you most certainly know, on Sunday, the 27th UN Climate Change Conference came to an end in Sharm el-Sheikh, or COP27. And I just said it, it's Conference of Parties, and they met for the 27th time. And it showed that, well, an increasingly tense geopolitical context is not making it any easier for climate diplomats to agree on concrete goals. And our German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, said that the outcome included light and shade. Well, sometimes the glass is half full, sometimes the glass is half empty. But we know that we are still on a path toward a 2.7 degrees goal of global warming. And COP27 could not have changed that. And that is why I would say the glass is still half empty. Well, 197 countries were negotiating at the COP27, but there are some countries that are a bit more important, that are bigger than others. And today we would like to deal with such a country, namely China. China is responsible for 1/3 of global emissions. And without an ambitious climate policy from the government in Beijing, and this is obvious, the 1.5-degree target agreed in Paris in 2015 will be missed in any case. But our own energy transition is very difficult to implement without rare earths, for instance, that we get from China. We need them for our solar and wind power plants or for the production of batteries. So without China, everything is very difficult. And China has set itself very ambitious targets when fighting climate change. They want to reach the maximum level of CO2 emissions by 2030. That's their CO2 peak. And they would like to be climate neutral by 2060. The second largest solar park of the world is located in China, but at the same time, 3 out of 4 coal-fired power plants that have recently been connected to the grid in 2020 are located in China. So today we would like to shed light on those two phases of China's climate policy. And China is so important in our fight against climate change. As you know, at the Körber Foundation, we have always placed great value on our exchange with China, but the conditions have become increasingly difficult in recent years. And this is also reflected by the public opinion in Germany. Once a year we conduct a survey, which we call the Berlin Pulse, and the latest survey that we conducted in fall showed that 59% of Germans rate China's international influence as negative, and in 2017 this was only 34%. So this goes to show that the perception that we have of China has deteriorated. And this is another reason why we want to discuss how we can work together with China, but not just within politics, but also when it comes to the role civil society can play. For this occasion, we have invited 3 excellent speakers, and I would first like to welcome Liu Hong Chao. I don't know whether she has joined the meeting already, because she joins us from Paris, and I hope that she can hear me. She is a freelance journalist and policy advisor in Chinese environmental and climate policy. And the online magazine Vox recently described her as the journalist holding China accountable for its role in the climate crisis. Liu Hong Chao, a very warm welcome to you. I would also like to welcome a politician whom you most certainly know. His name is Jürgen Trittin. He might be one of the most known politicians from his party, the Green Party. He's a member of the Bundestag, and he was the Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. And he is the foreign policy spokesperson for his party, representing the left fringe of the Green Party. A very warm welcome to you too.
And I would also like to welcome Annika Kruse.
She's a climate activist, and she's a spokesperson for Fridays for Future here in Hamburg. She studies political science, and we just talked about this. Ms. Kruse is here for the second time this week, which is a premiere, because she was here to discuss freedom and justice among generations here at the Körber Foundation. So a very warm welcome to you too for the second time this week. My colleague Julia Ganter will moderate today's conversation. She's responsible for our China and Asia-related activities at our Berlin office, and she's also responsible for the survey that I referred to before, Berlin Pulse. And she's also responsible for a publication that discusses the results of the survey. The conversation will take place in English, so if you would like to follow the discussion in German, please get a headset so you can follow the interpretation. And I would also like to thank the Hamburg Senate Chancellery for the excellent cooperation within the framework of this event, China Time. And with that said, I would like to thank you for listening, and I would like to pass the floor to my colleague Julia Ganter. I would also like to welcome you. I would like to welcome the people here in the room, but also those who are connected online. And I look forward to today's discussion. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up a bit sooner at 8:15. But I will give you the opportunity to ask some questions. Towards the end of today's event, a colleague of mine will go through this venue to give you a microphone in case you want to ask a question. But you can also send us your questions online. You can go to www.menti.com, use the code that you should see online, but the code is 39782623.
And with this, I switch to English, as my great panelists have already been introduced, and we also can see Liu Hong Chao now from Paris. And as there's a lot to discuss, I jump right in with the first question. And Annika Kruse, you have been to COP27. You came back on Monday, you told me. And while most of us probably followed the climate conference in Egypt only in the news, you have been there in person and followed it closely. So I would be really interested to hear from you, what were your impressions? Which impressions did you bring back from there?
I think my main impression from this COP was mainly just a big chaos. It's probably no big surprise to anyone. There was a lot of critique to the Egyptian COP presidency as well. So kind of the whole progress of COP this year has been like overshadowed by also like many debates about human rights. But also the outcome is kind of, it can be seen from two ways, because it's a huge step that there even is a loss and damage fund that is historic. It has been discussed for 30 years. Small island states have brought the issue of loss and damage up in the early 90s, and since then nothing has happened on loss and damage. So this year was kind of a breakthrough moment for that, because it was the first time where countries actually said that yes, the global north has to pay, also for loss and damage, not just from mitigation and adaptation. So that was a big breakthrough. However, it's Of course, the last COP has not brought us any closer to actually limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees, so it's questionable whether it actually was a success or not.
And while maybe previous COPs have not only been better organized, they always took place in a very different geopolitical setting. Given the Russian invasion in Ukraine and its global effects. So do you think that this geopolitical implication had an impact on the outcome of the conference from your observation on site?
Yes, it was very obvious that the energy crisis that was, of course, like mainly caused by the Russian invasion has had a really big impact. It kind of overshadowed the discussion about whether fossil fuels or just coal should be included in the final communiqué. So that was a big issue. Also, another issue that we have with the Russian invasion when it comes to COP and also the Glasgow Agreement was that the Glasgow Agreement actually says that fossil fuels need to be reduced. However, it also says that when there's a situation of emergency, then you can build new fossil infrastructure. So countries now tend to argue with the situation of emergency. So that has, of course, been a debate at COP.
And you're a climate activist. We can already perceive that by the in-depth knowledge that you have about all the things that were going on at COP27. And as an activist, you usually protest, right? But protests were not really possible in Sharm el-Sheikh, or it was at least difficult. So what are your learnings when it comes to climate activism in a repressive system?
Yes, it was very interesting protesting at COP, because obviously at any COP there's the opportunities to protest are very, very small. There's usually 5 spaces to protest within the building, and then normally you can protest outside. This time it wasn't possible, but even protesting in the building, you could not name any country, name, or company. So basically there were fossil lobbyists within COP, but we couldn't even name them because that's illegal according to UN rules. But it was almost impossible to protest outside. There was this designated protest zone, which no civil society group really wanted to use, because it would only be used for astroturfing groups from the Egyptian government. And I think it was very frustrating to see, because we were there and we could protest, and we could basically do what we thought was right, but it was so shocking to remember that if people that actually lived in Egypt would have done the same, they would have been arrested for it. And that's a very frustrating thing to know, I guess.
So the last question I have for you with regards to COP, because we are not only discussing climate tonight, but also have a specific focus on China. So China is currently the biggest emitter, and it's considered the key actor for reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. So what image did you have of China's performance? How did China behave, its representatives on site in Egypt?
At first, I thought China was not that present in many debates at COP. I have a feeling that, like, most debates were dominated by, of course, the EU, the US very, very strongly, and also Egypt and Saudi Arabia. There was mainly one point when it comes to China that was actually very, very present, which was the whole discussion about loss and damage. Should China pay, or should China actually be paid? Because they're often argumenting as being a developing country, just to get money from the new loss and damage fund. So that was a discussion that was very, very heavily discussed during COP, and which, was of course a bit, I don't know, weird to see.
we definitely will come back to that issue because it was really big debated. But first of all, I would like to hear from our guest from Paris, Liu Hong Chao. The US President Biden, he has been attending COP, and also the German Chancellor. But Xi Jinping, the president of China, he did not attend the conference. He sent his special envoy for climate change. So what does this tell us about the priority the Chinese leadership gives to climate policy in general?
Thank you for the question. I really wanted to be here with you in person, but I hope this video participation wouldn't compromise too much of these results. I thank you for your question on this. I think a general misunderstanding about China's climate policy is that the politician, the president, should be there alongside other heads of states in COP. We didn't see that this year. We didn't see that last year either at Glasgow. However, I don't think this conveys a message that China is not serious about climate change. And actually, if one looks into all the policies in China on climate change, one would get a very clear idea that Xi Jinping, our president, is actually personally behind many of the decisions, and that intention, that political interest that he has on climate change, basically shaped and leveled up the priority of climate and environmental protection, which is part of his concept, political concept of ecological civilization. In the general governance system of China in the past 10 years. So I guess it's hard to tell just by him, the fact that he didn't attend the meeting, to say that China is not serious about climate change. But sure, I guess compared to other Western countries and many other countries, he didn't attend, which is a fact.
And now talking about being serious, China has set the goal for its climate emissions to peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. However, 60% of China's electricity generation capacity is currently coal. So, Liu Hong Chao, how likely is it that China reaches its 2030 and its 2060 goals?
Yeah, it's really difficult for China to reach the 2060 goals, as I expressed and wrote about in many occasions. But I think peak emissions before 2030 is really a low-hanging fruit, and many scenarios, more from scientists, actually show that China could peak emissions before 2025, which will be in the next 3 years. However, I think the COVID situation might have an impact that potentially postpone this deadline. But however, if we look into China's recent emissions in the past 2 years, emissions this year in 2022 actually started to drop, which also breeds an anticipation that China's emission might have already peaked. So what we're facing today is that the real question today at the moment is that how China will recover from the economic downturn, and whether it will continue the business as usual approach to boost the economy, which will really decide when and to what level China will peak its emission, be that before 2025 or before 2030 as the official pledge indicated. But I just want to add something on coal, since you just mentioned
sure.
as a reference. We talk about coal a lot when we talk about China's role in climate change or in its energy transition. But we also need to look at China's 60% of coal-powered electricity in a historical landscape. China did bring down quite a lot, significantly. Let me put it this way: 15 and I remember 22 percentage points since 2009 as a percentage of coal in China's primary energy consumption and electricity consumption. So the percentage has dropped However, because China's overall economy and the energy demand has been growing, so we are still seeing slight increase, well, not slight, but these days it kind of slowed down in coal consumption. And I think that's where a nuance matters when we talk about coal and other things related to China.
We come back to that coal issue for sure later on, but you already mentioned maybe a keyword that I would like to direct to Jürgen Trittin, business as usual, because this year's COP was already the 27th COP, the 27th time that countries negotiated, yet the new record level of the three main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, were reported in the atmosphere this year. So instead of limiting global warming, and we've heard that in the introduction, we are rather on a 2.4 to 2.8 degrees track. So, Mr. Trittin, why should we even bother to mark our calendars for COP28 in Dubai next year?
Well, first we have to understand that these mechanisms in the international climate diplomacy is not a soccer championship. We tend to see this as a soccer game and try to look who is the winner and who's the loser. The truth is it's more comparable to a Chinese philosopher that the way is the target or the way is the goal. In this case, we didn't reach what we tried to reach in Europe as well, to have more ambitious national climate reduction goals. That was not happening. So you are right, we have still an increase and a tendency to go not only to the 2.6 or 2.8, but beyond that. On the other side, we have for the first time introduced that mechanism on loss and damages, and for the first time we have overcome the traditional form of splitting the world into two parts. It's true, China hasn't talked a lot on the climate. They hide themselves behind others. And that became obvious in the moment as Europe moved, with the pressure also from Germany, in the case we will do a fund, we will build up a fund for the most vulnerable states on consequence on loss and damages. And that moment, China had to come out of the shadow, and they did so because they didn't want to pay. They wanted even to have money from that, and that is a little bit beyond all questions what is about the per capita emissions and so on. China is responsible for a third of global emissions. They are also still rising if you take into account the problems with COVID, and for the first time China has the lowest growth rate compared to Asia. That's the first time we have disturbances of the chains of delivery and that is, but it is now not excluded that at the end China has to pay for that fund.
So you already referred to China as hiding itself behind its statues to be a developing country that it has since many years. But should we then let China get away with this behavior?
No, we should be very clear on that. China is the largest emitter compared to US and to European Union. They have lower per capita emissions than we have in the US and in Germany or in Europe. But if you look, and that's the most significant figure, it's not the annual emissions. It is who is responsible for the historic burden in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases.
Which currently is the US?
That is firstly the US, on the second place the Europeans are, but it's about 2 years that China will pass them all. So the responsibility for climate crisis for China is then higher than from the US and from the Germans as well. I think she's right that China is very aware on that. In many cases, China is more ambitious on tackling climate change than the US. You have elements of an emission trading scheme. China is investing more money as the European Union and more money than the US in building up capacities for renewable energies. So it's a double phase. On one side, the still dependency on coal that is going down, but it's still high, and growing emissions, and on the other side, closing thousands of dirty industry plants by brutal manner. That was simple expropriation. They closed it, and by building up such elements like an emission trading scheme and a lot of investment for renewable energy.
And this double phase is also the reason why we gave this event this title. Now there's also not a double but a triple when we look at how Europe and Germany actually look at China, namely as a strategic rival, a competitor and a partner. Now climate cooperation is indispensable. That's, I think, what we all agree on. Yet China is not only seen as a partner when it comes to climate cooperation, but also as a competitor, for example, when it comes to green technology. So, Mr. Trittin, how should we bring these concurrent dimensions together in order to work together on climate with China?
The German government is working on a new China strategy, and it will stick to these three elements: partner, competitor, and systemic rival. But we have to have clear that the role of the systemic rivalry is growing. That has to do with that China is no longer really a reliable international partner. We have seen this with the abolishing the principle of one country, two systems in Hong Kong, with didn't respecting the ruling of the International Court on the South Chinese Spratly Islands. We see the ongoing threat to use force for unification with Taiwan, and that is all worsening the relations between China and the rest of the world. The second thing is, you can't look, there is one field where China is a partner, and there is another field where there's a competitor, and there is a third field where there's a systemic rival. We have to understand that in every question of relations to China, these three elements are incorporated. To give you an example, look on what is happening on the PV industry globally. The PV industry in Germany was killed by political decisions. Altmaier and Philipp Rösler and Merkel. But the huge boost for the PV industry in Hong Kong, in China, has taken place not only with German technology, but with massive subsidies. That means with unfair competition conditions. So we are now in a situation confronted. There is a monopoly for PV units for China, and you can go on if I tell you on the systemic rivalry. To close without any compensation thousands of plants. Maybe they are dirty industry, but this is a form of climate policy that do not fit to our system of the rule of law. So we have to understand that partner, competitor, and systemic rival is in every question in our relations to China.
Thank you for clarifying that. Annika Kruse, we have already heard a little bit about the fact that coal makes up a big chunk of the energy mix in China. And 85% of new coal power plants worldwide are currently built in China. And these power plants will be there for decades, and they will cause more emissions, that's for sure. So do you think that the EU and Germany are doing enough by just talking to China about climate protection, or should they use other measures maybe?
At first, of course, it's, well, according to the IPCC and according to staying below 1.5 degrees, it's inevitable that the whole world is climate neutral by 2050, so that the whole world needs to shift to zero carbon by 2050 in order to stay below 1.5 and just, for it to be 66% likely to stay below 1.5, to be clear. But I think of course, Germany or the EU might have an impact on China, but what's also missing in these global contexts is actually a country that actually acts in line with 1.5, and that's not happening either in the EU nor in Germany. Both the EU and Germany, they both don't have actually climate targets that are in line with 1.5 degrees, and for them to, in order for them to like really be able to demand from other countries that they stick to the 1.5 degrees limits, it would be necessary that they do it themselves.
Mr. Trittin, because Annika Kruse is mentioning that there was also a report 2 weeks ago published by the federal government's expert council on climate issues, mentioning or indicating that Germany will most likely miss its 2030 climate goals. Now, yesterday I've heard Jennifer Morgan speak at the Hamburg City Hall at China time, and she said that China even needs to reach its carbon peak before 2030. So do we even have the right to point our finger at China and others if we ourselves don't really lead by example here?
I think the question is more or less that we have to do our homework. We need more ambitious national reduction targets in the European Union. It is on the way, but it is not decided until now. We have to correct the policies of the last years. Especially also in Germany, where we have growing emissions, especially in the transport sector. All things that happened in Germany was done in one sector, the electricity sector. In all other areas, there was constant or even an increase of CO2 emissions. That is what we have to organize in Germany for that. But let me add one thought. I'm not that convinced that all these coal-fired power plants will run in China for more than 40 years. Because the experience we made in Germany, and you have an example with Moorburg here, is that on a specific level of renewables in the grid, they have a massive competitive advantage that those coal-fired power plants ran out of rentability. And that's one thing that China is in a situation where they will come to. In that moment, I'm not convinced that all these, and it's bad that they invest in that, and I'm criticizing that, to be clear on that, but I'm not convinced that they will run for 40 years. That is not our experience we have made here in Germany.
Let's ask Liu Hong Chao what she thinks. Do you agree, 40 years maybe, and then China won't run these newly constructed coal power plants anymore?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that you just raised. Chinese energy advisors to the government, for example, the Energy Research Institute run by the state planner NDRC, they actually estimate most of the coal-fired power plants would continue to reduce their operational hours to about 1/3 of today's level, to reach to a level that is close to coal power plants here in Germany and even in Nordic countries. And that means, and also if we look at the recent policies and situations on the ground, is that coal-fired power plants are no longer permitted just to meet the demand of power generation, but are ready to reposition themselves as regulators, as you just said. But at the moment, I think the logic of continuing investing in building coal power plants in China at the moment might just be a result of, they've done this for a decade, and also because there's cheap access to cheap finances. But also, I think most importantly is the concern to energy security. As you just mentioned, 60% of electricity in China are still coal-fired, generated from coal. And in peak seasons, for example, during the summer, as we see the historical, like we've never seen this scale of heat wave in China. more than 80% of the peak demand was, at certain hours was met by coal. However, by saying all that, I try to give you a more nuanced picture, because when, on one hand, coal is still responsible to play a very significant role in meeting electricity demand, its role is gradually replaced, and actually at a very astonishing speed, by renewable energies. And as we can see in the summer, from January to August this year, the incremental electricity demand growth from last year, only 5% was met by coal. All the rest was met by hydropower, wind and solar, nuclear. So I think we're witnessing a trend that is happening at the moment, that is the role of coal as peak demand regulators would continue, will be gone very soon. But at the same time, they will gradually replaced by renewable energies. And just to remind you the speed and scale of renewable energy development in China.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking before about also Europe's role. You're now describing maybe a positive trend going on in China, despite this, at the moment, rather negative-looking trend because of the coal power plant construction. But I remembered hearing or reading something from you, where you were mentioning that Europe, compared to the US, has a little bit a different role, and that China also looks at Europe from a very different perspective, rather as a mediator. So we were now talking about the question if we have any impact on China, despite these positive trends that you are describing. But what would be your assessment of this? How should Europe use this role also maybe to accelerate those positive trends that you're describing?
Well, to clarify, those are not positive trends per se. These are trends among trends that we need to see in a big, fuller picture. And I've been arguing all the time that the obsession on coal from the climate community has unfortunately resulted to a situation that we miss out the full picture. Now back to your question about the EU as a mediator. I meant that compared to the US-China rivalry situation that we talk about all the time in geopolitical settings, EU-China relations in the Chinese eyes happens to be a little bit mired compared to the US-China situation, and I think EU and especially Germany has been actually share some of basic business logics and the pragmatism towards economy. I think brings China and the EU together. But how can the EU have a bigger influence, or to accelerate the process? I think we really need to go back to some basics to understand China's position. What are the difficulties? Why China, for example, refuses to identify itself as a developed country in negotiations like this, and to also understand the transition that is happening in China. It's happening at a stunning speed, but also acknowledging that is extremely difficult and it requires a lot of, for example, technical transfer, maybe not directly, but an experience sharing. And I think those are all still areas that EU and China can still cooperate on. And just the case that you just MP just mentioned is that the coal power plants here, what EU experiencing in the past 20 years is what China is experiencing and is going to experience in the next 20 years. And that experience sharing will of course accelerate the coal phase out and improve the robustness of China's grid, which is the key to China's to the heart of the Chinese policymaker, which is security.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have talked a lot about governments doing things or not doing things, and I would like to come back to you, Annika Kruse, and talk a little bit more about civil society. Now, Fridays for Future Germany is in contact with many activists worldwide, or at least I'm sure you have met a lot of them at COP27. Are you also in contact with climate activists in China? And if so, what do they tell you about their work?
That's very hard. I think it's very hard to know whether there are still climate activists in China or not. There most likely are climate activists, but we barely know of them, probably. There has been one girl who has been also school striking in China. There's been multiple people, but she was the one that was like mainly present, like Howie. But she is not in China anymore. I don't know what exactly she is doing, but I know that she has left China, and I know that Fridays for Future did exist in China a couple of years ago, and in the beginning it was supposedly doing quite okay. They had some demonstrations even, apparently, but it has been forbidden, and I think most, at least Fridays for Future activists, I think they stopped, but we can only assume because it's incredibly hard to look for contacts in China in climate activism.
Mm-hmm. Liu Hong Chao, listening to Annika Kruse, and also I remember reading an article about the fact that Fridays for Future was banned all its websites and social media accounts in 2021. In China, it sounds like the climate activist scene in China is rather non-existent, or at least not visible for us here. One reason for sure is a repressive government with all its implications, but in addition, studies also show that people in China do not really worry about climate change. Is that also your impression?
You asked two questions, actually. One is about youth activism, right? And the second is about the general public's perception about climate change. I think well, I will just quote a report that I actually read recently, which is produced by the China Youth Climate Action Network, a youth-led climate action, NGO. They surveyed over 5,000 students, young students between the age of 18 to 24, and they found that 84% of them have shared the view that they are very concerned about climate change. However, analysis into these results also show they are concerned but not well informed. So I think we need to look into the methodology of all that, but that's not a justification of what you just quoted. On that point, I just want to add, climate change is real, it's happening, people feel it in China as well. The extreme flood, the heat wave, people feel it. However, compared to people here, I'm based in Paris, when you hear and read about climate change all the time from the media, you get a sense of it. It's about education, it's about literacy, it's about science literacy on climate change. We don't see that much in China, which might explain why people, even though they experience, they suffer from the consequence of climate change, but they can't really link the experience they have to the very abstract concept of climate change. However, that doesn't really show whether they are concerned or not. It's if you don't know what it actually refers to. And also, I think it's about the stage of development. I cite this data all the time, which is over 600 million people, which is about 60%, more than 80. How much percent? 600 million people living in China still only lives with a monthly income of $140 a month. That's not a lot. And for them, when they don't have job security and a lot of other things, they don't have public health access, etc. Climate change for them is so remote. And I think this is, again, is not justification, but to give you more context why that had happened. But again, I think back to what Annika was sharing. I echo and I sympathize at the difficulty of the Fridays for Future network to access youth activists in China. I actually interviewed quite a few so-called youth climate activists in China. They share different views on activism, on climate change. They would prefer to be constructive rather than go to the street. And we don't have the culture of protesting either. The entire civil society ecosystem is different from here as well. They prefer to be constructive. They would like to change from the inside. They would like to be part of the regime, to change, to be the think tank, to be the brain, at least in the future, to help China to deliver, to design and to deliver better policies so that change can happen. Mm-hmm.
That truly is an interesting report from your side, and maybe I can add, because you mentioned it, that also here in Germany we can perceive from the survey results we do that climate change is ranks higher in the minds of people here when other issues are not so predominant. This is what we regularly see also in the Berlin Pulse survey results. Now, you have mentioned already that maybe in China it's also difficult for people to inform themselves about what is actually going on. And you're a journalist, so you know from your own experience that media can pressure governments and companies to improve their climate and environmental action by reporting about them. So how much does media cover environmental pollution and pitfalls of climate policy in China? And is it affected by censorship, this kind of reporting?
Well, to start with, China is not exempt from the global decline of the media industry. Journalists are poorly paid, like here. That kind of explains why talents, young journalists, middle-career journalists have left the industry, which leaves, which means the knowledge, the capacity of reporting, and to dance with censorship or dance with the public surveillance system and a lot of other things, all the tactics of doing investigations in China have lost in the intergeneration change. But I also want to add that environmental journalism it's still one of the few areas where investigation can still be done, can still be can still carry impact. I started my career as an investigative journalist, specifically covering environmental issues. And when I started my career back in the early 2010, we witnessed a wave of collaborations between the civil society, environmental NGOs, and environmental journalists like myself, and the policymakers and the scientists who actually have made air pollution on the top of agenda of the political decision making, and consequently we have actions, etc., to tackle air pollution and among other things. That tradition remains. It's just for a lot of practical reasons. It's not as prosperity as it can be. However, I also want to remind that when we talk about media in China, we kind of have this narrow mindset of institutional media, of state-owned media or market-run media. China has a very rich and a diverse culture on we media, self-media, not just a TikTok, but individuals publish analytical articles on WeChat, which is very popular in China. And those segmented media, those industry-led media, those influencers, written professionals who write about energy, environmental issues, and climate change, they're also very influential, and they actually step up when institutional media couldn't really do their job. And myself started a newsletter as well, but I'm struggling with business models, so it's not an easy job.
Thank you for this also personal, professional experience that you shared with us. Now, I want to come back to the geopolitical setting once again, Jürgen Trittin. And as we are talking about authoritarian states here, and for the next question, I have to give a little bit of pretext, and I also want to share a slide from the Berlin Pulse survey, because Russia's invasion of Ukraine provoked a process to rethink dependencies Germany and European neighbors have with other countries. Now, as you can see up here, the German public, they take a clear stance on this, as our survey shows. 66% of Germans, they want to become economically more independent of China, even if this leads to economic losses. But what about the German government? Our energy transformation currently depends heavily on China. Of 30 raw materials, such as magnesium, raw earth, and bismuth, that the EU classifies as critical, 19 are predominantly imported from China. And there's also another dimension on that. 82% of polysilicon, which is the most important substance for solar panels, is produced in China, mainly in the province of Xinjiang, that most of us have surely heard about, where different sources report also forced labor with the Uyghur minority. So now a leak of the Germany's forthcoming China strategy that you have mentioned before shows that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wants to link cooperation with China to human rights in the future. So I would like to hear from you, Mr. Trittin, how to realize the energy transformation in Germany without increasing these dependencies that I've just talked about, and also remain true to a values-based foreign policy approach that the new German government wants to pursue.
I think we have to make ourselves clear that we have a situation of common dependency, firstly. It's not only that Germany or Europe is dependent on China. China has also a market dependency with the European Union as one of the most interesting markets in the world. Secondly, it is not comparable to Russia. The dependency to Russia is ridiculous to the coupling of the European economy with China and vice versa.
But would that not even be...
So what we are trying to reach is to go back to the principle of reciprocity. That was the reason why my party and the foreign minister was not saying yes to selling parts of the harbor of Hamburg to a Chinese company and a state-owned company. At the same time, if they are not allowing us to be part and owner of the harbor of Shanghai, why should they be owner of the harbor of Hamburg? And that is what the thinking of reciprocity is. And then we have to look where we have to diversify and where we have also to relocate production. And we have to invest for that. Diversifying means that a lot of companies, especially medium-sized companies, are looking to other places to produce, to have other sources of raw materials. Sometimes monopolies are not physical monopolies, they are economic monopolies. You can find the same things, some rare earths, for example, in other parts of the world. You can substitute this, you can build up forms of more recycling and reusing things. These are all things we have to do. And what I think, what we also have to do is, and that is, from my view, if we talked about partnership, competitive and systemic rivalry. The main battlefield will be the competition. There, to introduce principles on that, not only on reciprocity. We couldn't accept products from forced labor of our markets. There is in preparation a European law that will stop this. And the Chinese have very well understood it. They ratified 2 ILO treaties that the US never have ratified on forced labor. So we are in a process not of decoupling, but on diversifying and relocating. And relocating will be in the pharma sector, will be in the sector of PV unit production, and we have to go on and stabilize our industrial capacity in wind turbine production and so on. These are all things that will be part within these strategy. We have not the illusion that we can become independent from China. And China do not have the illusion that with their double circle economy they will become independent from the world's markets. That's an illusion on both sides. But to become more resilient by more diversification, by reciprocity and by relocation of strategic industries back to Europe, that will be the course of the new strategy.
Now, listening to you, I heard a lot of we have to. And you mentioned by yourself the example of the harbor here in Hamburg, Costco, where your party also said that we have to not allow this deal, but at the end it happened a little bit different than it was first thought to happen, but still it was made, that deal. So,
but other decisions were not accepted. You know, the chip factory was not allowed. And I think an example like KUKA today would be impossible. We will go on building up I was a little astonished that to define what is a strategic industry is not the question of state. The owners of these infrastructure decide themselves whether they are a strategic industry or not. That has to change, and we will change that law on that. For sure, it is to have, because we have to correct a policy that went on for 2 decades, that everything what is good for the large German companies, and these are mainly the 3 automotive and BASF, that this is German-China policy. This is over. We won't succeed on that. And the industry, and that's the interesting development within the German Association of Industry, the BDI, has broken with that principle a few years ago. So we are in a new process to define our China policy different to that what was the normal course with the Chancellor Schröder as well as Chancellor Merkel.
So from what you just said, I can maybe understand that we do not only have to, but also will read about all those things in the forthcoming China strategy.
We didn't give any, for example, state investment guarantee for investments in Xinjiang for the well-known, medium-sized Lower Saxony company located in Wolfsburg.
So all these points you mentioned, I ask again, is something that we will read in the forthcoming China strategy.
We will go on that course. It will be a debate within the government, for sure. This is the proposition or the draft from the Foreign Office. But we have seen that also the Ministry for Economy is sharing that view. They have been in front of stopping these investment guarantees in Xinjiang. And we are in favor of that law on banning products from forced labor on the European market. So it's not only the will of one ministry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for giving us a first glance of what we can expect maybe in spring. Before I open it up to the audience, I have a very brief question, and I want you to look into your crystal balls and tell me, in 10 years from now, will China be a climate pioneer or a climate sinner? And you have to pick one of the two. So maybe Annika Kruse, what is your guess? Brief question, brief answer, please.
I think autocracies can be climate pioneers, because if it's an autocracy and it's still climate neutral, it's still an autocracy. So basically, in my view, it still destroyed what we wanted to save in the first place.
Thanks.
So,
For me,
you would go for climate sinner.
Yes.
For me, sinner is not a political category; it's religious.
But you can't escape from responding this question.
I'm convinced that at the end, the pressure from climate crisis, in combination with the steps they have done and the huge investment they are now increasing in renewables and so on, will lead to a situation that is perhaps not a pioneer, but is in reaching their targets, because they don't have a real alternative. It's the same thing as we are talking about. We shouldn't be such dependent on fossil resources. But at the end, we needed a war from Russia to understand this is true.
So this is rather a climate tyranny, what I heard from here. And Liu Hong Chao, what's your take?
In 10 years' time, China will already start, its emissions will start to decline. Which means the peak has surpassed. And by reaching that goal and arriving at net zero on time, China will be able to avoid the same amount of emission that it has emitted in the past 30 years, in the next 30 years, between 2030 and 2060. So in a way, it's doing its share. Whether it's a fair share or how fair it is that it's doing, it's up to debate. However, I kind of agree with that point that China is on a trajectory of transition. And that transition on energy, on climate actions are happening faster than the government's own targets require. And that kind of gives me hope.
So I have 2 times pioneer and 1 time sinner here. And with this rather optimistic note, maybe, I want to open it up for questions now. Some housekeeping remarks before we start. Please raise your hands, and my colleagues will come with a microphone. Say who you are, stand up, be crisp and concise, and remember that every question should end with a question mark. And please also say to which speaker you would like to direct your question. And for our online audience, you can submit your questions via menti.com. And the code that I have said in the beginning, I won't repeat it, but you can see it online if you want to submit your questions. So, who wants to be the first and break the ice? I see my colleague Lucy is raising the hand. Is there already something from online?
Yes, we already have a lot of questions here online. The first is for you, Liu Hong Chao. Our viewer wants to know what's your take on China's concept of ecological civilization, which will be guiding the upcoming biodiversity COP15 in Canada.
Thanks for that question. It's a really, so to start with, ecological civilization is a really broad concept, but it's one of the fundamental governing philosophy of the current the presidency of China. And we are seeing emergent links between biodiversity and the climate in policy making. However, it's hard to tell how far we can go in setting goals in this CBD COP. But again, it's like climate change. It's probably even more urgent to achieve that 2030 roadmap on biodiversity.
Thank you, Liu Hong Chao. As long as I don't see raised hands here. Ah, yeah, sorry. Yeah, right in the back. Please, Lara.
Ich arbeite in Hamburg. So thank you for all the speakers here. I have a question to Mr. Trittin. I have a humble question. Why, I don't really understand why in the last few years it's so important for the German government to emphasize that China is and is going to be the systemic rival of Germany. Because I don't understand really exactly, because China's system and Communist Party exist for more than 60, 70 years. And Chinese live in the same, even better condition compared to the past. So why it's now so important to emphasize this kind of, you know, uncomfortable relationship? Thank you.
I'm traveling to China since more than 20 years. And I can give you a lot of examples what has changed within China and within the Communist Party that is ruling for more than 60 years. They have done a huge job to lift 800 million people from absolute poverty to more or less middle-class life. That is something nowhere in the world has happened. But I give you a very slight example. As I started in 2001 to organize in China, in Beijing, the first conference on renewable energies, together with the Commission on Development and Reform. We said to them, it may be that there are some Greenpeace guys and they will demonstrate there. And it happened on the place of Heaven's Peace. If you would try this today, it will never happen. That's the difference. At that time, we had very open and frank discussions with those who are responsible within the Commission. And we were really, after the first exchange of opinions, all the drawings from both sides were put aside and we had a frank debate. This is over. We have a development within China from what I would call a resilient autocracy with elements of self-corrections. That has to do with you have power of time, you have changes in the persons, you have a collective leading. This is everything over. And this has caused internally away from resilient autocracy to a more or less totalitarian system, and has made in the international policy China less reliable than before. The times of Deng Xiaoping, who said, we don't want to become a big power, we do our job, and it's better to see us not. This is totally over, and that is the reason why the role of the systemic rivalry plays a bigger role now in the relations between Europe and China. It's not, firstly, that we wanted to do that. I think that the German China policy for a long time was blind to that development. Now, no one can oversee it, because it had also economic consequences. Look at the medium-sized company from Germany that runs a plant in China. And they couldn't visit that plant for 2 years. The only guys there are the members of the Communist Party in the government. So they have the feeling it's no longer their company. So this has changed. And that is something we have to have in mind if we speak about relations to China.
Thank you. Maybe Lucy has another question for us from our online audience while you're thinking about yours. And if you feel more comfortable to ask your question in German, that's not a problem. I can also translate for Liu Hong Chao. Lucy, please.
Yes, I have a question for you, Annika Kruse. The persuasive power of authoritarian states to fight the climate crisis more effectively is anchored above all in the minds of young Europeans. How much does the climate policy performance of democratic countries impact your faith in democracy?
I think it's always a hard question, because I always ask myself, well, in some authoritarian states, at least that's what I have learned in Egypt, that, for example, in Egypt, which is an autocracy, that the scientists in Egypt are not even able to really track emissions and to really track new fossil fuel infrastructure or fossil fuel projects. So I think that in some authoritarian states, we don't even know how the CO2 emissions are, because you cannot control them as well as in a democracy, because we have freedom of speech and a free research, and other countries just don't have it. So I think it's really complicated to say that democratic countries perform worse than autocracies. I also believe that we go to the streets to fight against climate change, and we're all concerned about climate change because we want to save the planet as it is. And if we want to save the planet, we also want to save our freedom on the planet. And in an autocracy, we would not be free. So what would we want to save? So I think that's always an important question to ask ourselves. Why do we even want to save the Earth? And would we want to save it if we were living in an autocracy anyways? So I think it's kind of a complicated question.
Thanks for your answer, despite the fact that it's a complicated question. And I think we have time for one more question. There's one person here in the second row. Please stand up.
Yeah. Hello, I'm Amba Hasselbach. I'm a student from Hamburg here. And I have a more general question, I guess, not for someone specific. And I was just wondering, what happens or what do we do when we come to the realization that global players like China are not reaching their goals and that they aren't necessarily lowering their emissions? What happens? Like, do we just continue to look and try to reach our goals, or do we face catastrophe, or I don't know, it's just...
Thank you. I think that's an excellent question to hear from three different perspectives that you all have. Very briefly to finalize, and I ask you to be brief because we have limited time. So maybe Liu Hong Chao, can you start? What do we do?
So one thing about China's climate policy, if there's one takeaway you would take from me from this event, is that China's climate policy has always been under promise overachieving, which means, when China pledged to peak emissions before 2030, it is really likely that the government decision makers are thinking about 2027 or 2025. So the assumption of that China is not lowering its emissions on the schedule or goals are not being kept often is a false assumption. However, I do understand where this question comes from, which lies with the transparency issue, which Annika was just talking about. But thanks for technologies, we can now monitoring emissions with satellite images, for example, and that provides us tools to even monitor and keep China accountable without actually living in China or with access to government data. I don't know if that. Yeah, I just stop there.
Thanks, Jürgen Trittin. As a politician, what would you do?
There are three main instruments. The first one is important but oft beloved: name, shame, and blame. The second thing is building up alliances. China experienced this now because the Europeans built an alliance with the most vulnerable countries. And so this is pressure on them. And the third thing is to build up an economy, for example, by a carbon border adjustment that stops the import of climate hazardous goods. So we have these three main instruments. But at the end, we need, on the international level, more or less a consensus. There is no world without the members of the United Nations.
Thank you. And Annika Kruse, as a climate activist, what would you do?
At first, I think it's also important to keep in mind that that would not be a new thing. We have seen countries not sticking to their climate targets for decades. The first climate summit was in 1992, and since then emissions have been rising. So countries not sticking to their own targets is a very, very common thing. And so far in the global climate regime, there are no real global consequences. But what always gives me hope, it's that it's important to remember that in the future, countries just won't be competitive without any climate targets, that fossil infrastructure will not be competitive in the future, and that the damages from climate change that basically every country will have to face will be big enough that countries will act.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is up, and I want to close with a quote that I heard yesterday at China time at the Hamburg City Hall. the scientist Mujib Latif quoted Albert Einstein, and Einstein once said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." So I think developing new and innovative thinking to contain the climate crisis is something that is a task for Germany, but also for China alike. And it might be a good basis for cooperation, but also for fruitful competition, as we talked about both tonight. So thank you very much. Thank you to the stellar panel. Thanks for the audience for listening so closely online also and here in the room. And also to my colleagues, especially to Lucie Courtade and Lara Emmerich, who have been here with me tonight. Und liebes Publikum, I switch to German now again. Wir laden Sie gerne noch auf ein Getränk bei unserem Empfang ein.
We would like to invite you to have a drink outside, and we can discuss the topics and have a nice end of this evening. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.